Ada Pruett was told to empty her apron pockets in front of 11 men. She was 24 years old. She had worked that land through a year of dust and short water, and now she stood in Harmon Volk's front room while 11 grown men looked at her hands. There was a seed sack on the table. A mended sack, the corner sewn shut with jute twine, and Volk held it up like it was proof of something. He said the count came up short, $214 short. He said it slow, so every man in the room could hear the number land. She did not cry. That is the part people remember wrong when they tell it now. They think she cried. She did not. She turned her pockets out slow, one and then the other, and let them fall inside out against her skirt so the men could see the lint and the one bent nail and nothing else. She let them look. She did not say a word while they looked. And Harmon Volk, standing there before 11 hands he still owed their year's shares, looked around the room and said it plain. He said, "A hired girl doesn't leave my county with clean hands and my money both." He held her whole year of wages against a shortage she never touched. There was a stranger at the back of that room, a man she did not know, sitting in a straight chair near the door, a notebook open on his knee and a pencil in his hand, not writing just then, only watching. He had come about something else. He had come about the federal seed loan. Nobody paid him much mind that night, least of all Ada. So the next morning, she walked 4 miles down a frozen section road to a government office that hadn't existed the year before. If you believe quiet people read the fine print, this story is for you. Before I go on, if a story about a wronged person getting made right is the kind of thing you came here for, take 1 second and subscribe. Because that is the only kind of story I tell. And do me a small thing. Comment the town you're watching from. Just the name of your town. I want to see how far this story travels. Then settle in. Because we have to go back before that front room. We have to go back to how a girl ends up counting another man's seed in her head because nobody will give her a book. Ada Pruett came to Volk's place in the spring of 1935. She came because there was nowhere else to be. Her father had farmed a quarter section over near the cottonwood breaks, 160 acres that his own father broke out of the sod. And in the fall of 1933, the bank took it. It was not a dramatic thing. There was no sheriff, no shouting. A man in a gray suit drove out from Delft with a paper, and her father signed where the man pointed. And that was the whole of it. The land that had fed 3 generations went back to a ledger in town, and her father's hands, which had never in his life been idle, had nothing left to hold. He did not last long after that. A man like that does not. So Ada hired out. She was young and she was strong and she asked for honest work, and Harmon Volk had 320 acres of leasehold ground near Delft that needed hands. He took her on for the house and the yard and, when the season pressed, the barn and the field. He paid a hired girl's wage, which is to say almost nothing, and he paid it once a year at settlement, the way the old landlords did, holding your money over your head like weather all year long. She took it because the Volk place sat close. From the top of his North 40, on a clear morning, she could see the line of cottonwoods that marked her father's lost creek. She could stand at the fence and look at the ground that used to be theirs. I want you to understand that. She did not stay for Volk. She stayed for a view of a farm that was not hers anymore. Ada was honest the way some people are tall. It was not a decision she made. It was just how she was put together. She had a habit that the other hands laughed at, and Volk found useful. She counted. Anything that came onto that place, she counted it, and she kept the number in her head, because a hired girl does not get a ledger. A ledger is a thing of authority. A ledger says your word means something on paper. Nobody handed Ada a book. So she made a book behind her eyes, and it was as accurate as any bound in leather, and it cost Volk nothing. And he liked that just fine until the year it cost him everything. Now, the seed loan. In the early spring of 1936, the money came. You have to remember what those years were. The country was on its knees, and the government had begun, in its slow way, to reach out a hand to the farms. There was a program that spring that advanced seed money to operations that could show they would plant. Federal money, loaned against the crop. So a man with ground and no cash could still get seed in the earth. $600 came to Harmon Volk's operation for spring planting. $600. I want you to sit with what that was in 1936. Because if I tell you it plain, it sounds small. And it was not small. It was a year's living for a family. It was more cash than most men in Cottonwood County saw pass through their hands in 5 years. It came as credit, and it came as sacks, good seed grain, wheat, and sorghum trucked out from the elevator in Delph on a flatbed and stacked in Volk's seed barn under Ada's eyes. And here is the thing that will matter. That money was not Volk's. Not clean. It was federal money passed through his hands, loaned to his operation, and it carried the government's mark on it whether Volk liked it or not. He did not think about that then. He thought of it the way he thought of everything that came onto his place. He thought it was his. The sacks came off the truck on a cold, bright morning, and Ada stood at the barn door and counted them. Of course she counted them. She counted every sack, and then, because she was Ada, she weighed the ones she could get onto the platform scale, the old iron scale by the granary door with the sliding weights, and she wrote the numbers behind her eyes. 2 of the sacks ran light. Not much. A few pounds under what a full sack of that seed should carry. But she had weighed 100 sacks in her life, and she knew the honest heft of one, and 2 of these did not have it. One of the 2 had a mended corner, the jute twine sewn tight where the sack had been opened and closed again. She stood there with her hand on the mended corner, and she felt the wrongness of it the way you feel a false note in a song. Most people would have shrugged. Sacks settle. Grain shifts. It was a few pounds. But Ada was not most people, and she had already learned at 24 that the only protection a person without power has is a witness and a date. So she did a small, careful thing that would, a year later, save her life. She walked into Delph to the feed store. Delphine Ott kept the counter at the feed store. She was a sharp woman of middle years with reading glasses on a chain and a memory like a bear trap, and she liked Ada, which was more than most in that town could be bothered to do for a hired girl. Ada came in and bought a spool of the jute twine, which she needed anyway. And while Delphine wrapped it, she said, plain and quiet, "Delphine, the seed loan sacks came to Volk's yesterday. 2 of them ran light on my scale. One's got a mended corner." And then she said the important part. "I want you to remember the date, whatever comes of it. You remember I told you today, the 9th, that 2 sacks came in light before I ever laid a hand to that seed." Delphine looked at her over the reading glasses. She did not laugh. She said, "You want me to write it down? If you would." And Delphine Ott took the little pad she kept for accounts, and she wrote, in her own hand, the date and the words, and she tore it and pinned it to the board behind the counter, where she pinned the things she meant to keep. Ada watched her do it. Then she took her twine and walked the 4 miles home. I want you to hold on to Delphine Ott. She is going to matter more than she looks like she matters right now. That is how it goes with the people who bother to write things down. They look like nothing until the day they are the only thing. When Ada told Volk about the light sacks, and she did tell him because she was honest even when it was foolish to be, he did not even turn around. He was at the workbench mending a trace chain, and he said, over his shoulder, "Sacks settle. Girl, you weighed them cold and they came off a warm truck. Don't go making arithmetic where there isn't any." And that was the whole of his answer. Sacks settle. She let it go. On the outside. On the inside, she kept the number. Now around that same time, a thing happened in Delph that nobody thought was a thing. The county opened an office. Down in the basement of the courthouse, a room that had been storage, they cleared it out and put a desk in it and hung a card on the door, and it was some new federal resettlement office, part of the same programs the seed money came from. There was a man assigned to it, though most folks hadn't met him yet. And one afternoon at the elevator, standing around waiting on a grain check, a couple of the hands got to joking about it, the way men joke about the government. One of them, a lease hand named Pole, said something Ada happened to hear. He said, laughing, "You know what they tell me? That government fella in the basement, he can look at any account the seed money touched. Any book at all. Man takes a federal dollar, the government gets to read his mail." And the others laughed, because the idea that anyone could make Harmon Volk open his books was the funniest thing they'd heard all week. Ada was standing at the wagon, and she heard it, and it went past her like wind. She did not stop and think about it. Why would she? A hired girl does not think about audits and federal authority. She thought about whether the horses needed watering before the drive home. The most important sentence she would hear all year went in one ear and kept right on going, exactly the way the big things do when you're too tired and too small to catch them. But you caught it. Remember that a man from the government down in that basement could look at any account the seed money touched. Set that on the shelf. We are going to take it down again. Planting came. They put the seed in the ground the last week of April, Volk and Kyle and the hired hands, and Ada carrying water and seed and keeping, of course, the count. And when they were done and the drills were cleaned and put up, there was a problem. The seed came up short of the acreage. They had planted less ground than the seed should have covered, or they had run out of seeds sooner than the acreage said they should. Either way you turned it, the seed did not go as far as $600 of seed should go. Now a fair man, faced with that, asks a fair question. Where did the seed go? But Harmon Volk did not ask it fair, because Harmon Volk already knew where the seed had gone, though nobody in that field but him knew that yet. He stood at the end of the last drilled row with his hands on his hips, and he looked at the short rows and he said, loud enough for Kyle to hear and for the hands to hear, "There's been waste in that barn. Somebody's been careless with government seed." And when he said it, he looked at Ada. He did not say her name. He did not have to. He looked at her the way you point without lifting your hand, and Kyle, his boy, standing there with the day ledger under his arm, followed his father's eyes and saw where they landed. That was the second stone laid. The first was the light sacks he waved off. The second was waste in the barn, spoken in front of a witness, aimed at the only person on that place who kept an honest count. Ada did not answer. What was there to answer? A hired girl does not stand in a field and call the landlord wrong. She held the water bucket and she looked back at him and she said nothing. And Kyle watched the both of them. And Volk turned and walked to the truck, satisfied, having planted the second seed of the year that mattered. I want to tell you about Kyle Volk, because he is going to break my heart before this is over, and I'd like you to know him first. He was 27 that spring, Harmon's only boy. And he had the disease that the sons of hard men catch, which is that he wanted his father's approval the way a plant wants sun, and he had never once gotten enough of it to grow straight. He kept the day ledger. His father had taught him figures and handed him the book, and Kyle kept it beautiful. That is the terrible thing about Kyle. He had a lovely hand. He wrote his columns clean and square, and he never blotted, and he added true. And he was proud of that book. Proud of the one thing his father trusted him with, and he did not know. He genuinely did not know that spring, that his father was feeding him numbers to copy that were not true. He copied them clean. He made his father's lie beautiful in his own honest handwriting, and he thought he was being a good son. Hold on to that too. The son's clean hand, copying the father's crooked figures. It is a nail waiting for a hammer. The summer was the summer. The wheat came up thin where the seed ran short and heavier where it hadn't, and the sorghum did what sorghum does, and the county baked, and Ada worked. She did the house and the garden and the chickens and the canning, and when harvest came she worked the harvest, and all through it she carried the count, because that was who she was, and because some part of her, some careful animal part, knew the day was coming when she would need it. She did not know how it would come. She only knew that a man who says waste in the barn in a field in April is building towards something by December. So she kept the number. Every sack of seed that came in that spring, what it weighed, Which two ran light? Which one had the mended corner? She could have recited it in her sleep. And then it was settlement. You have to understand what settlement was if you didn't grow up under it. On the old lease places, the landlord kept all the accounts all year. Every hand's share, every advance, every charge against them at the landlord's own store or the landlord's own credit, it all lived in the landlord's book, and once a year. Usually near Christmas, the landlord called everybody in and read out what they'd earned and what they owed and handed over what was left. And whatever the landlord's book said, that was the truth of it, because the landlord's book was the only book there was. There was no arguing with it. You could no more argue with the settlement book than you could argue with the weather. The man who kept the book kept the truth, and everybody in that room knew it. And that is exactly the power Harmon Volk was standing on when he held up that mended sack. It was the third week of December. Cold and clear, a hard blue sky and snow crusted in the fence lines. The settlement was held in Volk's front room, the way it always was. The good room with the wallpaper and the parlor stove going hard. 11 hands came in from around the place, lease men and their grown sons, men who had a year's shares coming, and they stood or sat around the walls in their good coats with their hats in their hands, waiting to be paid. And at the back, by the door, in a straight chair, sat the stranger. He had come that afternoon, quiet, and said he had business with the account and would wait, and Volk, who did not know yet who he was, or thought he was only some clerk, let him wait. Nobody introduced him. He sat with his notebook closed on his knee, and he watched the room fill. Kyle sat at the table with the ledger open. His beautiful clean book. Volk stood by the stove and ran the settlement. He was good at it. He read out each man's shares and the men nodded, and he counted out money and the men took it, and it went along ordinary for the better part of an hour, share and money, the parlor warm, the men easing, thinking of home and Christmas. And then he came to the seed account. He let a little silence fall first. That was Volk. He knew how to build a moment. He set down the money box and he picked up the ledger from in front of Kyle, and he looked at it a long moment, frowning, as though something in it grieved him. Then he said, "There's a matter I hoped I wouldn't have to raise in front of everybody." The room went still the way a room does. "The federal seed account," Volk said. "The spring loan. $600 of government seed came onto this place, and it was in my charge, and I'm accountable for every cent of it." He turned a page. "And it's short. $214 short. Seed that came onto this place and did not go into this ground and is not in this book. He let that sit. $214. In that room, to those men, it was a fortune. It was more than most of them would clear in the whole settlement. And then Volk reached down beside the table and he brought up the sack, the mended sack, the one with the corner sewn shut in jute twine. He held it up by the neck for the room to see, and he said, "This came in light. My hired girl waited herself in the spring." He looked at Ada, who was standing near the kitchen door where she'd been carrying coffee to the men. "Didn't you, Ada? You waited and told me it ran light." And there it was. The trap he'd been building since April, sprung so clean and so cruel that Ada felt the floor of her stomach drop. He was using her own honesty against her. She had told him the sacks ran light. She had made a point of telling him and telling Delphine and marking the date, and now he was turning it around and holding it up as proof that she had known about the shortage. That she had known because she had made it. "You knew about that seed better than anybody on this place," Volk said, soft now, terrible. "You weighed it. You counted it. You had the run of that barn all summer with nobody watching. And now it's short the exact amount of 2 men's shares, and I've got 11 honest men in this room who earned their money and are owed it out of an account somebody has bled." He set the sack down on the table. "Empty your pockets, Ada." The room was so quiet you could hear the stove. "Empty your pockets," he said again, "and let these men see. Because I'll not have it said Harmon Volk covered a theft on his own place. And Ada Pruett, 24 years old, in front of 11 men she had cooked for and carried water to, set down the coffee pot and turned out her apron pockets. Slow, one and then the other. She let them fall inside out, and she stood there with her empty hands open at her sides, and she let every man in that room look at her. And she did not cry, and she did not shake, and she did not say one word. Volk looked around the room. He had them. He could feel that he had them. And he said the thing that would follow Ada Pruett through that whole county for a year. A hired girl doesn't leave my county with clean hands and my money both. He said her year's wages would be held. All of it. Against the shortage. Until the matter was cleared, which meant forever, because he had no intention of ever clearing it. He said it the way a judge passes a sentence, and the 11 men sat in their good coats and looked at their boots. And not one of them said a word for her. Not one. Because Volk kept the book, and the book was the truth, and a hired girl was a hired girl. At the back of the room, by the door, the stranger opened his notebook. And he wrote something down. Ada did not see him do it. She picked up the coffee pot with steady hands, and she carried it back into the kitchen, and she set it on the stove. And she stood there in the dark of the kitchen with the warm noise of the settlement going on behind her. And she understood that her life in Cottonwood County was over. She would leave. She would leave with no wages and a thief's name, and she would never again stand at that north fence and look at her father's creek. That was what he had taken. Not just the money. The last thread that held her to the only ground she loved. That is where a lesser story ends. The powerful man wins. The small honest one packs her bag. The world shrugs. And Lord knows that is how it went 10,000 times in those years, and nobody wrote it down. But there was a stranger at the back of the room with a notebook, and he had written something down. And he had come about the seed money, and I told you to remember that a man from the government could look at any account the seed money touched. We are about to take that down off the shelf. Word travels fast in a small county, and bad word travels fastest. By the Sunday after settlement, it was all over Delft that Volk's hired girl had bled the seed account, that she'd been caught. That Volk had held her wages against the theft and been Christian enough not to have her arrested. That was the version. That was the only version, because the man who kept the book kept the truth, and the book said thief. Ada felt it at the church steps. She had gone into the Delft church that Sunday, the way she always did, and she felt the room change when she came in. The little turnings away. A woman she'd known 3 years gathered her children in closer as Ada passed the pew, the way you'd pull a child from the edge of a well. On the steps after, a man she'd never had a word with said, not quite to her but meant for her, some folks got no shame taking government money that isn't theirs. And Ada walked down the steps and down the road and did not answer, because there is no answer to a whole town that has decided. She went back to her little room over Volk's washhouse. He'd not thrown her out yet. He was enjoying it too much for that. And she took down her cardboard case and she began to pack. It did not take long. A hired girl does not own much. A few dresses, her mother's Bible, a hairbrush, a photograph of the farm. She packed it all and she sat on the bed and she thought about which way she would walk. West? Maybe. There was nothing west, but it was away. And away was the only thing left to want. And the next morning, walking into Delft to buy her bus fare with the little coin she had saved out separate all year, she stopped at the feed store. She hardly knew why. To say goodbye to Delphine, maybe, to have one person in that town look at her like a person before she left it forever. Delphine Ott looked up when the bell rang, and she saw Ada's face, and she saw the cardboard case in her hand, and she came out from behind the counter. "You're leaving," Delphine said. "There's nothing to stay for." Delphine looked at her a long moment over the reading glasses. Then she went back behind the counter and she reached up to the board where she pinned the things she meant to keep. And she took down a small square of paper and she laid it on the counter in front of Ada and turned it so Ada could read it. It was Delphine's own hand. The date, the 9th of the spring. And the words, Ada Pruett told me today that 2 sacks of the Volk seed loan came in light before she ever handled the seed, one with a mended corner. You told me, Delphine said quietly, before you ever touched that seed, that it came in light. You made me write the date. You remember why you did that? Ada looked at the paper. She did not answer. You did it, Delphine said, because some careful part of you knew this day might come. Well, it came. And I've got it in my hand, in my writing, with a date on it. And that means whatever Harmon Volk says in his front room, there's one other book in this county besides his. Mine, she tapped the paper. You knew the sacks were light before you had a chance to steal a thing. That's not the record of a thief, Ada. That's the record of a witness. Ada Pruett stood in the feed store with her bus fare in her fist, and something in her that had lain down began, very slowly, to get back up. It doesn't matter, she said, and her voice was not quite steady now, the first crack in a whole day of stone. It doesn't matter what you wrote down or what I know. He keeps the book. He is the book. Men like Volk are never reached, Delphine, not by a scrap of paper on a feed store board, not by me. That's just how it's built. And that right there was the blind spot that had kept her honest and small her whole life. She believed the powerful were beyond reach. She had watched a bank take her father's land with a paper and a gray suit and no one to stop it, and she had learned the lesson that everyone learns in a hard place, which is that there is them and there is you, and the them are made of a different, harder thing, and you do not touch them, you only get out of the way. She was about to be shown she was wrong. Because the bell over the door rang, and a man came in out of the cold. Ada knew him before she placed him. It was the shape of him, the straight chair, the notebook. It was the stranger from the back of Volk's front room. He had a plain gray coat and a plain face, a man past 40 with the flat, careful eyes of somebody who had seen a bad thing far away and come home quiet from it. He stamped the snow off his boots and he took his hat off, and he looked at Ada, and he said her name like a question. You're Ada Pruett. She did not answer. In that town, 3 days past that settlement, having a strange man know your name was not a safe thing. My name is Elias Vance, the man said. I keep the resettlement office in the courthouse basement. He turned his hat slow in his hands. I was at your settlement Thursday night. I want you to know I wrote down what I saw. He paused. And I don't believe you took $1 of that seed money. The feed store was very quiet. Delphine stood behind her counter with the little square of paper still on it between them. Ada found her voice. It doesn't matter what one man believes. No, Vance agreed. It doesn't. And then he said the thing that would take the top off Ada Pruett's whole understanding of the world. But I'm not one man with an opinion, Miss Pruett. I came to this county about that seed loan. That $600 that came onto Harmon Volk's place in the spring, that's federal money. And there's a new law behind it, a law most folks in Cottonwood County haven't caught up to yet. He set his hat on the counter. Any settlement, any account, any book that the federal seed loan passed through is subject to a federal audit. That means Harmon Volk's book is no longer only Harmon Volk's business. It's mine. The minute that government seed came onto his place, he stopped being the only man in the county allowed to read his own ledger. Ada stared at him. He held a girl's wages and turned out her pockets in front of 11 men, Vance said, over an account he doesn't get to keep secret anymore. He just doesn't know it yet. He looked at her steady. So before you buy that bus ticket, Miss Pruett, I'd like you to hear what the law actually lets me do. Because I think you've spent your whole life being told that men like Volk can't be reached. A faint hard thing moved at the corner of his mouth. Not a smile, something older than a smile. The whole point of this new law is that this time he can be. Outside, the Delph bus came down the frozen street, threw its long shadow across the feed store window, and rolled on past toward the west without her. And Ada Pruett set her cardboard case down on the feed store floor. She did not sleep that night. She lay on the cot in the room behind Delphine's store, the one Delphine had opened to her without a word, and she looked at the ceiling. She thought about the 4 miles. She had walked them once already, home from the settlement, with the whole town watching her back. She could walk them again. Morning came gray and hard. The frost had drawn ferns on the window glass. Ada put on her coat. She did not take the cardboard case. She left it on the floor by the cot, and that felt like a thing she was saying to herself. She was not leaving. Not yet. The courthouse sat at the end of Main. The resettlement office was in the basement, down a flight of stone steps that had worn soft in the middle. There was a door with a paper sign taped to the frosted glass. The paint smell was still fresh. This office had not existed the year before. A hand had joked about it once. At the barn. Some easy thing about the government man who could look at any account the seed money touched. She had not listened. She had been counting sacks in her head. The way she always counted, because no one gave a hired girl a book. Elias Vance was at his desk. There was a low window behind him, at ground level, and through it she could see the boots of people passing on the walk. He stood when she came in. He did not smile. He seemed to know why she was there. "I want to file it," Ada said. "Sit down first," he said. "Read it. All of it. I don't want you signing a thing you haven't read." She sat. He slid the form across. It was a plain sheet, government print, with lines for her name and the date and a box of small type. She read every word. Her father had lost their quarter section to the bank in the fall of '33, partly because he signed a paper he trusted a man to read to him honest. She would not do that. She read it twice. "It says you're requesting a federal audit of the seed loan settlement on Harmon Volk's leasehold," Vance said. "It says you claim the shortage was charged to you falsely. Once this goes in, I open the books. Not the ones Volk lets me see. All of them. And I'll tell you plain, Miss Pruett, a man like Volk does not forgive this. If you sign it and I find nothing, you've got no home in this county and a landlord who'll see to it you get none. And if you find something," Ada said, "then it isn't your word against his anymore." He set a pen on the desk. "It's the ledger against him." She picked up the pen. Her hand was steady. She had turned her pockets out slow in front of 11 men and let them look, and her hand had been steady then too. She signed her name. Ada Pruett. Below it the date. The last week of December 1936, Vance blotted the ink. He put the sheet in a folder and the folder in a drawer, and the drawer made a sound like a thing closing that would not open the same way again. "It's done," he said. "Go on back to Delphine's. Don't talk about this, not to anyone. Let the paper do the walking now." She went up the worn stone steps into the cold. She felt lighter and heavier at once. She had been told her whole life that men like Volk were never reached. She had believed it the way she believed the sun came up. And she had just signed a piece of paper that said maybe that wasn't so. Vance drove out to the Volk place 2 days later. He did it by the book, the way he did everything. He handed Harmon Volk a formal notice, folded, printed, that said the seed loan account for the spring of 1936 would be audited under the authority of the county resettlement office. And Harmon Volk read it standing in his own doorway, and he laughed. Kyle told Ada that part later, though she didn't know it yet. His father had laughed and said, "Let him look. My book's clean as a whistle." And he had sent Kyle to fetch the day ledger, and he had handed it over to the government man with his own hands, easy, the way you hand a fellow a cup of coffee. He was that sure. The numbers in it were Kyle's numbers, copied out clean in the boy's careful hand, and every figure matched every other figure, because Kyle had copied them from the slips his father gave him. Volk stood on his porch and watched Vance drive off with the book and felt like a man who had called a bluff and won. He did not understand yet what he had handed over. For a week nothing happened, and the nothing was its own kind of loud. Ada worked in the back of Delphine's store, sorting bins, keeping quiet, and she felt the town moving around her like water around a stone. The church steps had called her a thief. Now the church steps didn't know what to call her. Word had gotten around that the government man was in Volk's books. And the town didn't like that either. A landlord's business was a landlord's business. That was how it had always been. Volk understood the town, even if he didn't understand the ledger. And he was not a fool. He knew how to work men. So he changed his tune. He came into Delft on a Saturday and he stood on the feed store porch where everyone could hear him, and he said, loud, that he'd thought it over and he'd decided to forgive the girl. That was the word he used. Forgive, he said. Times were hard and a young woman could be tempted, and he was not a man to ruin a life over $200, and he would let the matter drop if she would. He made himself into a big man, doing a kind thing. And he watched to see if it landed. It was smart. Ada saw how smart it was. If she took it, she was a forgiven thief, and the shortage stood, and his book was never opened. If she refused it, she was the ungrateful one, dragging a generous man through the mud with the government at her side. He'd built a trap with 2 doors and put her in the middle. Delphine wanted her to answer it. Ada wouldn't. Let the paper do the walking, she said, and she went back to sorting bins. What she didn't see was the other thing Volk did that week, the quiet thing. He drove to the county seat and he sat down with Commissioner Pruett. Pruett owed Volk a favor from a land matter 3 years back. The kind of favor that never quite gets paid and never quite gets forgotten. And Volk called it in. He told Pruett that a New Deal clerk with a fresh desk was making a federal case out of a spat over a hired girl, and it was an embarrassment to the county, and somebody ought to tell the young man to find real work. So Pruett sent for Vance. Ada heard about that part from Vance himself, weeks on when it was all over. But it happened like this. The commissioner had Vance into his office, an office with a rug and a fire and a photograph of the commissioner shaking a senator's hand. He was friendly. He was always friendly. He told Vance he admired a man who took his job serious. Then he told him the audit was a nuisance, a small settlement matter, a landlord and a hired girl. Nobody up the line wanted the resettlement program remembered as the outfit that harassed decent farmers over pocket change in the middle of a drought. He said it gently, and he let it hang. And Vance nearly folded. He would tell Ada that too, plain, because he was a man who didn't dress up his own weaknesses. He was new. The office was new. The whole idea that the law meant what it said was new and untested, and a word from a commissioner could snuff a new office like a candle. He sat in that warm room and he thought about the drawer with the folder in it. And he thought maybe it wasn't worth a girl's $200 to break his own program before it drew its first breath. He went back to his basement office. He took out the day ledger, Kael's clean copy, and he looked at it one more time before he closed the drawer for good. And the numbers were too clean. That was the thing he couldn't let alone. He'd been in the Great War. He'd learned that when a story has no rough edges, somebody sanded them off. A working barn loses seed to rats and rain and spillage. It always shows in the book, a little, here and there, the small, honest waste of real work. Kael's ledger had none. Every figure sat square with every other figure like soldiers dressed for parade. A ledger that clean wasn't a record of a farm. It was a record of a story somebody wanted told. So Vance did the one thing the commissioner couldn't stop him doing, because the law let him do it, and the commissioner didn't understand the law any better than Volk did. The federal seed loan gave him the right to cross-check. Not just the landlord's book, the other end of it. Where the seed went, where the money moved. He drove to the Delft grain elevator, and he asked the elevator man for the private buying receipts from the spring of 1936. Every sale that came across that scale under every mark in the county. The elevator man didn't want to give them. Vance showed him the printed authority. The elevator man gave them. Vance took the brown envelope of receipts back to his desk, and he laid them out under the low window, and he went through them by the light of a single bulb, and somewhere in the third week of that going through, he found it. There were sacks of seed grain sold at the Delft elevator in the early spring of 1936, weeks before planting. Sold under Harmon Volk's own mark. Federal loan seed, the seed that was advanced to go into the ground on Volk's leasehold, sold out the back before it ever got near a furrow. And Vance took the weight off the receipts, and he took the weight Ada had logged missing when the sacks came in light, the two that ran short and the one with the mended corner, and he laid the two figures side by side. They matched. Not close. Exact, the mended sack was light because Volk had drawn it down himself. He'd sold the government's seed under his own name, pocketed the money, and then charged the whole to a hired girl who kept her tally in her head because nobody had ever given her a book. Vance sat with that a long time. Then he wrote to the county for a reconvening of the settlement. The same room. The same 11 men. Every one of them. He came and told Ada only that it was time and that she should be there, and that she should say nothing until he was done. He didn't tell her what he'd found. She would tell him later that she was glad of that. She walked into Volk's front room not knowing, and so no one could say her face gave anything away. It was the third week of December turned into deep winter now, and Volk's front room was warm with the same stove that had been warm the night he turned out her pockets. The 11 hands were there, on the same chairs and the same bench, hats in their hands. Kyle stood by the wall near his father. Tobe Harkin, the old lease hand with the white stubble, sat closest to the stove. And he was the one who'd muttered at the first settlement that the hands' shares had come up light that year, and been hushed. Delphine had come, and she stood in the doorway, and on the table, in the middle, sat the mended seed sack, the same one, its corners sewn with the same coarse thread. Volk stood at the head of the table like a man who owned the floor. He thought he'd been called there to be thanked for his patience, or at worst to watch the government man fold and go home. He looked at Ada once, and there was something in his look that was almost gentle, the look of a man about to be generous in public a second time. Vance did not sit. He stood at the foot of the table with a folder, and he opened it, and he read in a flat voice. The voice of a man reading a weather report. He read the account. The $600 advanced in the spring. The seed truck to the barn. He read the figures out of Kyle's day ledger, the clean ones. Then he laid the elevator receipts on the table, one at a time, next to the mended sack, and he read those. The dates. The weights. The mark they were sold under. He said the mark aloud. Harmon Volk's mark. Sold in the early spring, weeks before any seed went into any ground on that place. The room had gone very still. Tobe Harkin leaned forward. The shortage is real, Mr. Volk, Vance said. He did not raise his voice. He didn't have to. It just isn't in her apron. It's in your handwriting. Nobody moved. The stove ticked. Ada stood by the wall and felt the whole night at the first settlement flip over inside her chest, the whole shame of it, and turn into something else. Volk's face did a thing then that she would remember the rest of her life. It went through 3 men in about 4 seconds. First the big generous landlord, still trying to hold his own face up. Then confusion. Real confusion. The confusion of a man who cannot understand how the walls of his own house are talking. Then, underneath, coming up fast, the fear. He had been certain. He had been certain his whole life that his land and his book and his standing put him past the reach of any government on earth. And here was a young man with a fresh desk and a brown envelope, reaching him. He grabbed for the first thing. He always did. That's Kyle's book, Volk said. His voice was loud now, too loud for the small room. My boy kept the day ledger. If there's an error in the figures, it's the boy's error. I never touched the thing. Ask him. Ask anyone. Kyle did the writing. And the room turned to look at Kyle Volk. Ada watched it land on the boy. He was 27, and he'd spent every one of those years wanting one thing, which was his father's approval, and she watched him understand in one long terrible second that he'd just been handed the whole weight of it to carry out loud in front of the 11 men by the man whose approval he'd wanted. She had never much liked K.L. He'd stood by that wall the day his father blamed her for waste in the barn and said nothing. But she felt something for him now, watching his face come apart. He could have taken it. That was the thing. He could have bowed his head and let his father hang the whole thing on his clean, careful hand, and maybe that was even what his father counted on. That the boy would eat it to keep the peace the way he'd always eaten everything. Kyle reached inside his coat. "I copied them," he said. His voice shook. "I copied every figure in that book. But I didn't make them up. I copied them off the slips. Off your slips." And he drew out a fold of paper and laid it on the table next to the receipts and the sack. They were small slips, torn ragged, covered in a cramped hand, a tight, hard hand, nothing like the boy's careful copy. Ada knew that hand. She'd seen it on the barn wall and on the door of the seed room. It was Harmon Volk's own. "You gave me these every week," Kyle said. He wasn't looking at his father. He was looking at the slips like he'd never really seen them before. "You told me to write them into the book fair and clean. I never checked them against the barn. Why would I check my own father's figures? I just copied what you wrote." And what you wrote is what he just read out. He looked up then, and his eyes were wet and furious both. "The book's in my hand. But the lie's in yours. It's right there. It's your writing." The old frame broke. You could feel it break in the room. The golden child, the one who kept the book, had just laid his father's own hand on the table beside the sack. Volk went white. He put a hand on the table to hold himself up. And that was when it moved through the 11 men. Slow, then all at once. Because they were farmers, and they could read a weight and a share better than any government man. And they were doing the sum. Tobe Harkin got there first. He stood up, old knees and all, and he pointed one crooked finger at the mended sack. "My share came up light this fall," Tobe said. His voice was gravel. "You told me it was a poor year. You told all of us it was a poor year, and the seed account ate the difference. That's what you charged against our shares." He turned to the other hands. He shorted the seed account by what he stole out of it. And then he shorted us to fill the hole. Every man in this room paid for what he took, and he let us think it was the drought, and he let us think it was her. The men were on their feet now. Ada saw it go across their faces one by one, the same turn she'd felt in her own chest, the shame of the night they'd watched a girl empty her pockets, flipping over into the understanding that they'd been robbed in the same breath by the same hand. And cheered it. One of them wouldn't look at her. Two of them looked at her straight, and one of those men, a big slow fellow named Pole who'd said the government audit thing at the barn a year back, without ever knowing it would come to this, took off his hat to her like she was somebody's mother. Vance let it run. He didn't hush it. When it had run enough, he laid one more sheet on the table, and this one he read quiet. "The federal loan money has to be repaid in full," he said. "Every dollar of the 600, plus the value drawn out early and sold. And the leasehold certification for next year's seed loan is withdrawn. That's automatic when the account's found in default by fraud. There's no loan for this place next spring, Mr. Volk, not from us. Not from anybody who checks with us first." And there it was, the whole shape of it. The man who was certain the government could never reach him was going to spend the next year paying the government back, and the year after that farming without the seed money every man around him would have. The system he'd laughed at from his own doorway had come down his own basement steps and read his own handwriting back to him. The door opened. Commissioner Pruett had come, late, sent for by somebody, and he stood in the cold doorway just long enough to see the slips on the table in Volk's own hand and the 11 hands on their feet. And he understood in about 1 second that there was nothing here he wanted his name near. He didn't even come in. He touched his hat and he was gone, and everybody heard his car start in the yard, and everybody understood what that was. The favor was not being called anymore. The favor had never happened. That was how those men worked when the wind changed. Harmon Volk sat down in his own chair at the head of his own table. He looked at his son, who would not look at him. He looked at the sack. He was 58 years old, and he had built a whole life on being past reach. And he had nothing to say, and for once the room did not wait for him to say it. Ada did not gloat. She had promised herself that, back on the cot at Delphine's, staring at the frost ferns, she would not become in that room the thing that had been done to her. So she stood quiet by the wall, and she let the men have their anger, and she waited. It was later, 2 days on, that Volk came to her. She was behind Delphine's counter, weighing out beans for a woman who'd called her a thief on the church steps in November and now couldn't meet her eye. The bell over the door rang, and there he was, hat in hand, smaller than he'd ever looked at the head of a table. He waited till the woman left. Then he came to the counter, and he did not look at Ada straight, and he said the thing he'd come to say in a low voice, so Delphine at the far end wouldn't hear. Though Delphine heard everything. It was a bookkeeping error, Volk said. That's all it was. A man loses track in a hard year. If you'd go to the agent, to Vance, and tell him you'll let it lie, that it was an honest mistake, a bookkeeping thing, nothing more, I'd see you right, Ada, I'd pay your wages out today. Every dollar. We could put the whole business behind us, say the word to him, and it's done. And Ada Pruett looked at him a long moment across the counter. She thought about the 4 miles. She thought about her pockets turned out slow while 11 men looked. She thought about her father signing a paper he trusted a man to read him honest. "I'll tell you the price," she said. Her voice was calm. It had been calm the whole way through, and it did not leave her now. "I don't want your money handed to me over a counter to keep me quiet. I want it counted out in that front room, in front of the same 11 men you made me empty my pockets before. And I want you to say, in front of them, in your own voice, that I never took a dollar, not a bookkeeping error, not a hard year. That I took nothing, and you knew it, and you charged it to me anyway." She set the bean scoop down. "Say that in that room. To those men. And we're square. That's the whole price. That's all I ever wanted said." Volk stood there. Delphine, at the far end, had gone still as the counter itself. And Volk understood that the girl he'd thought he could buy with her own wages was setting a price he couldn't cheat. Because the price wasn't money. It was the truth, said out loud, in the one room where it had been made a lie. He had no seed loan and no certification, and 11 men who knew. He had nothing left to trade with but the admission itself. So the price was the price. They reconvened the front room a 3rd time, and this was the one Ada had walked 4 miles for, though she hadn't known it that morning at the courthouse when she signed her name. The same 11 men. The same stove. The mended sack on the same table, in the same spot her pockets had been turned out over. Vance stood at the foot with his folder. Kyle stood by the wall now. Not near his father. The boy had moved his body across the room, and that told its own story. Delphine came, and Ada sat, this time, in a chair, because Vance had set one for her at the table itself. Vance read the reconciled account first. He read each hand's true share, the honest number, the one that stood before Volk shorted them to fill his own hole. And out of Volk's repayment, each man's short share was to be made right. Tobes, Poles, all of them. He read the amounts, and the men listened and nodded, and there was a kind of justice in just the hearing of the real figures, said Plain, in the room where the false ones had been read a year before. Then Vance closed the folder and looked at Volk, and he didn't say anything. He just waited. Everyone waited. Harmon Volk stood up. It cost him to stand. He looked at the 11 men, and he looked at the sack, and he could not look at Ada, and he said it. His voice was flat and low, and it did not want to come, but it came. "Ada Pruett took nothing," he said. "There was no theft. The shortage in the seed account was mine. I drew the seed and sold it, and I charged the whole to her, and I knew she was innocent when I did it. She never took a dollar off this place." He stopped. The stove ticked. That's the truth of it. Nobody cheered. It wasn't that kind of room now. Tobe Harkin nodded once, slow, like a man setting down a weight he'd carried a year. The big fellow Pole looked at his own hands. Then Vance took a canvas pouch from inside his coat and slid it across the table to Ada. It was her wages. Her full year's wages, the ones held against a theft that never happened, counted and pouched and put where they should have gone 12 months before. Ada picked it up. She opened it, and she counted it, once, in front of the room, the way you count a thing that's yours. She didn't do it to shame anybody. She did it because a girl who keeps her tally in her head counts what's put in front of her. Always, and she wasn't going to stop being that girl now that it had finally saved her. The count was right. She stood, and she thanked the room. She did it the way Vance had once said a thing that stuck with her. Plain, by name. She thanked Tobe Harkin. She thanked Pole. She thanked Delphine in the doorway, who'd written a date on a square of paper months before any of this and kept it. She went around the 11 men and named the ones whose names she knew and nodded to the ones she didn't. She did not thank Harmon Volk, and she did not curse him. She saved for him one dry line, said quiet, on her way past the head of the table where he stood. "Your book's read fine now," Ada said. "Mine always did." And she walked out of that front room into the cold with her year's wages in her hand and her name her own again, past the 11 men who had watched her empty her pockets and now watched her leave clean. There was one more room. The courthouse basement, the low window with the boots going by, the fresh paint smell almost gone by then. Vance had a paper for her on the desk. It was a resettlement grant application. He slid it across the way he'd slid the complaint form a month before, and this felt like the far end of the same motion. "You're clear on the federal record now," he said. "Named honest, in writing, by the same office that ran the audit. That makes you eligible. There's ground coming available under the resettlement program, quarter sections, 160 acres, to families and folks who can work them and haven't got their own. There's a piece I've seen, out near where your people used to farm." He didn't make it soft. That wasn't him. "It's your own book, on your own ground, if you want it." Ada looked at the paper a long time. She had walked into this basement a month before believing to her bones that the powerful were never reached, that a hired girl kept her tally in her head and kept her mouth shut and got the westbound bus in the end. She'd been wrong about that. A quiet man with a fresh desk had read the fine print, and it had turned out the fine print was on her side after all. She signed it. Her hand was steady. It had been steady the whole way through. Vance blotted the ink, and there was, for just a second, something in his face that was almost a smile, and never quite got there. The same not-quite thing she'd seen at the feed store counter the day the bus went past without her. Respect was what it was. Not more than that. And she wasn't looking for more than that. And the door of the thing stayed open the way an unlatched door does, meaning nothing yet, meaning maybe. "Thank you," Ada said. "Don't thank me," Vance said. "You're the one who signed the first paper. The law's only worth the ink if somebody's willing to use it. You used it." He put the folder in the drawer. That's the whole point of the thing. The bus she didn't take had gone west in December. By the early spring of the next year but one, she didn't need it. The porch faced east, so the morning came up over her own ground. It was early spring, and the light came thin and gold across 160 acres that lay near the old quarter section her father had lost to the bank in the fall of '33. Near it. Not it. But you could see the line of trees along the creek that ran through both, and that was close enough to mean something on a cold morning. Steam came off her coffee. She sat on the porch sill with the cup in both hands and watched the light move on the fields. Her seed sacks were stacked in the barn, weighed on her own scale, the scale standing in the yard where she'd set it. She weighed every sack that came onto the place. She'd have done that anyway. But she did it now with her own book, and the book sat on the porch sill beside her. A plain ledger with her own figures in her own hand. And every figure in it was true, because she'd never in her life written down a thing that wasn't. Word reached her. Now and then, the way word does. Harmon Volk worked another man's land these days, down the county, hired on where he'd once held the settlement book. Certified for no loan. A man past 50 who'd been sure the government could never reach him, farming on somebody else's certification, weighing somebody else's seed. Ada didn't take pleasure in it. She just noted it, the way she noted the weather. Kyle kept books for the co-op now. Honest ones, folks said. The boy who'd copied his father's figures without checking them had made a whole living, in the end, out of checking figures, and there was a justice in that too. The quiet kind. The kind that doesn't need a room full of witnesses. Ada drank her coffee. The light came up gold over the fields that were hers. She thought about the mended sack, and the pockets turned out slow, and the 4 miles and the square of paper Delphine kept. She thought about how long she'd believed a hired girl had no book and no say and no reach. What's counted crooked comes up short in the end. She knew that now, the way she'd once known the sun came up. Except this she'd learned the hard way, and the hard-learned things are the ones you keep. A man can sew a corner on a light sack. He can charge the hole to a girl who trusts too much and counts too quiet. He can be certain, all his life, that his standing puts him past the reach of any book but his own. But somewhere there's a scale that reads true. And somewhere there's a quiet person who reads the fine print. And when the two of them come together at a table, in front of the same eyes that watched the lie, the crooked count comes up short at last, every time, in the end. Ada set down her cup. The steam thinned into the cold air and was gone. She picked up her own book off the sill, and she went out into the gold light to weigh her seed. Comment the town you're watching from. I'd like to know how far this story travels.